While I was burying my wife, my son replaced every lock on the house I had built with my own hands. When I came home wearing the same black suit I had stood in beside her casket, my key no longer fit the front door. My son looked me straight in the eyes and calmly said, "Dad, you don't live here anymore." My relative stood on the porch in complete silence, avoiding my eyes as though I had already become a stranger. I didn't argue. I didn't pound on the door. I didn't beg my own child to let me inside. I reached into my pocket, took out my phone, and made one quiet call. 4 days later, a lawyer unfolded a handwritten letter my wife had left behind before she died, and from that moment on, no one in my family could bring themselves to look me in the eye again. If this story truly resonates with you, I'd be honored if you stayed with me until the very end. And if you're comfortable sharing, tell me the city or country you're watching from, along with your local time right now. I'd love to know how far this story has traveled and who might understand the weight of it. My name is William Carter. I'm 72 years old, and until the morning I buried my wife, I believed that no matter how broken a family became, grief would remind us that we still belong to one another. I was wrong. That day didn't just take the woman I had loved for 46 years. It changed the way I looked at my own son forever. The funeral service had ended just after 2 in the afternoon at a small church outside Franklin, Tennessee. The November air carried the scent of wet leaves, and a cold wind followed us as the last guests drifted toward their cars. I stood beside Evelyn's grave a little longer than everyone else. I wasn't ready to leave her. The fresh flowers surrounding her casket blurred through my tears, and I rested one hand on the polished wood before whispering the last promise I would ever make to my wife. "I'll be okay," I said softly. "I just don't know how yet." Pastor Michael placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Take all the time you need, William." I nodded without speaking. Words had become too expensive that day. By the time I drove home, the sun had already begun sinking behind the hills. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Children rode bicycles 2 streets over. Someone was mowing their lawn despite the season. Life had somehow continued while mine had stopped. I pulled into the driveway and noticed something that didn't seem important at first. The brass lock on the front door looked brighter than I remembered. Almost new. I climbed the porch steps slowly, exhausted from hours of shaking hands, accepting condolences, and pretending I still knew how to stand upright. I slipped my key into the lock. It stopped halfway. I frowned and tried again. It wouldn't turn. I pulled it out and looked at it, wondering whether grief had somehow made my own hands clumsy. Behind me, I heard the front door unlock from the inside. Daniel stepped outside wearing a gray sweater instead of the black suit he'd worn at the funeral. Rebecca stood a few feet behind him with her arms folded tightly across her chest. Several relatives who had arrived before me were still gathered inside the foyer, their conversations dying the moment they saw me standing there. "What's wrong with the lock?" I asked quietly. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He closed the door behind him until it clicked. Then he slipped a new key ring into his pocket. "I had them changed this morning." For a second, I honestly believed I had misunderstood him. "Changed?" I repeated. "Why?" He inhaled deeply before speaking in the same calm voice he used during business meetings. "Dad, I think it's better if you don't stay here anymore." The words didn't sound angry. Somehow that made them hurt even more. "This house," I whispered, looking past him toward the family photographs hanging in the hallway, "is my home." Rebecca lowered her eyes but said nothing. Daniel kept his expression carefully controlled. "Not anymore." I noticed Aunt Linda turn away toward the living room window. My cousin Mark stared at the floor. Nobody interrupted. Nobody told my son he was making a terrible mistake. It was as if they had all arrived at the same conclusion before I ever pulled into the driveway. "Where am I supposed to go?" I finally asked. Daniel hesitated only a moment. "You'll figure something out." I looked at him for a long time. I searched for the little boy who used to wait by the front window every evening for me to come home from work. I searched for the teenager who once told his mother that he wanted to build houses just like his dad. I couldn't find either of them anymore. The wind carried a single yellow leaf across the porch, where it settled beside the welcome mat Evelyn had picked out years ago. I bent down, picked up my old house key, and held it tightly in my hand. It suddenly weighed far more than a piece of metal ever should have. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask anyone to choose sides. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket, unlocked my phone, and dialed one number from memory. The man answered after the second ring. "Thomas Bennett speaking." I looked once more at the front door that no longer recognized my key. "Tom," I said quietly, "I think it's time." There was a long silence before he answered with words that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "William, I've been waiting for this call ever since Evelyn asked me to keep something safe." I spent that first night in a small roadside motel just outside Franklin. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee that had been sitting on a burner too long. There was a single bed, a wooden chair beneath the window, and a lamp that hummed every time I switched it on. I placed my folded funeral suit over the back of the chair, set my wedding band beside the lamp, and stared at the empty space where Evelyn should have been. For 46 years, I had never gone to sleep without hearing her quiet voice wishing me good night. That silence felt heavier than the locked front door ever could. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, another memory surfaced. Not the day Daniel locked me out. Those memories reached much farther back. Looking back now, I realize families rarely fall apart in a single afternoon. They crack a little at a time, so slowly that you convince yourself nothing has really changed. Evelyn used to notice those cracks before I did. She always smiled gently whenever she told me I believed the best in people for too long. "That is one of the reasons I fell in love with you," she once said as we sat together on the back porch watching the sunset. "It is also the reason people can hurt you without you seeing it coming." I laughed then and kissed her forehead. "Not our family." She did not answer right away. Instead, she looked toward the old maple tree in the backyard where Daniel had spent countless afternoons climbing as a boy. "I hope you are right. We built that house together when we were both still young enough to believe our backs would never ache." Every paycheck I earned as a construction supervisor carried another piece of that dream. Some weekends I poured concrete with my own hands. Other weekends I installed trim after borrowing tools from neighbors. Evelyn painted every bedroom herself because we could not afford to hire anyone. Daniel was only 6 when he carried tiny pieces of scrap wood across the yard pretending he was helping me frame the garage. "Am I building the house too, Dad?" he asked proudly one afternoon. I smiled and handed him a tape measure. "You already are. That house was never just lumber and brick. Every room held another season of our lives." The pencil marks inside the pantry door measured Daniel's height every birthday. The small stain near the kitchen sink came from the blueberry pie Evelyn dropped while laughing so hard she could barely stand. Even the loose porch step reminded me of the afternoon Daniel raced home after winning his first Little League game and nearly broke it jumping into my arms. Those memories became part of the walls long before any deed or property record existed. Somewhere along the way, though, conversations changed. Daniel stopped asking about family and started asking about numbers. It happened gradually enough that I kept finding excuses for him. One Sunday afternoon, he stood beside me in the garage while I sharpened an old shovel. "Dad," he asked casually, "have you ever had the house appraised?" I shrugged. "Not recently. It has to be worth a fortune now." I smiled without looking up. "To me, it is worth exactly one family." He chuckled politely, but the conversation stayed with me longer than I expected. A few months later, he brought it up again over dinner. Rebecca was cutting her chicken into perfect little squares while Evelyn served mashed potatoes. "You know," Daniel said, "people your age should think about simplifying life. Big houses become too much work." I looked across the table at Evelyn. She quietly set down the serving spoon before speaking. "We are doing just fine." Rebecca forced a pleasant smile. "We only worry about you both." Evelyn thanked her, but after they left that evening, she remained unusually quiet while loading the dishwasher. "Something bothering you?" I asked. She nodded slowly without turning around. "Did you notice how often they talk about the house now?" I leaned against the kitchen counter. "Young families think differently. They are probably just planning ahead." Evelyn dried her hands on a towel and faced me. There was concern in her eyes that I had rarely seen. "William, promise me something. Anything. Do not ever believe that kindness means giving away your place in the family." I reached for her hand. "Where is this coming from?" She smiled, but it never reached her eyes. "Call it a wife's intuition." I squeezed her fingers and told her she worried too much. I wanted to believe our son was simply under financial pressure. I wanted to believe marriage had made him practical instead of distant. Deep down, it was easier to question my own instincts than to question the boy I had raised. Sitting alone in that motel room, I realized Evelyn had seen the storm gathering long before the first drop of rain ever reached me. And for the first time, I began wondering what she had done after recognizing something I had refused to see. I remained at the motel for 2 more days, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I needed silence more than I needed comfort. Thomas had told me he would come when everything was ready, and after hearing the weight in his voice, I knew better than to rush him. Waiting gave me too much time to think. Memory has a strange way of arranging itself when your heart is broken. It does not begin with the biggest wounds. It begins with the small moments you ignored because love convinced you they did not matter. About 3 years before Evelyn passed away, Daniel started insisting that I let him help with our finances. At first, it sounded reasonable. "Dad," he said one Saturday morning while we drank coffee on the back porch, "you should not have to worry about bills anymore. Let me organize everything." I smiled. "I have been organizing them for almost 50 years. He laughed politely. "Exactly. It is my turn now." I appreciated the offer, but something about the way he said it felt less like kindness and more like an announcement. I declined, and he did not argue. At least, not that day. A few weeks later, he appeared carrying a folder. "I talked to a financial planner," he said. "There are better ways to protect your assets." Evelyn looked up from her gardening gloves. "Our assets?" she asked. Daniel nodded confidently. "Taxes, probate, long-term care. There are risks you are not thinking about." Evelyn exchanged a quick glance with me before asking, "Did we ask someone to prepare this?" "No," Daniel admitted, "but somebody has to think ahead." I closed the folder without reading a single page. "Your mother and I will decide when we need advice." Daniel forced a smile, but disappointment flashed across his face before he hid it. After that conversation, he became more persistent. Every family dinner somehow returned to the same subjects: the house, the property taxes, the insurance policy, the deed. Rebecca often joined in, though she always chose softer words. "We just want to make sure everything is simple later," she would say while clearing the table. Evelyn answered politely every time, but once they drove away, she stood at the kitchen window watching their taillights disappear down the street. "Do you know what worries me?" she asked quietly. "What?" "They never ask how we are doing anymore. They only ask what we are doing with the house." I tried to defend them again. "Life is expensive now." She sighed. "Love should not become expensive." One afternoon, Daniel arrived without calling first. I was replacing a loose board on the porch when he walked straight into the garage. "Dad," he shouted, "where do you keep the property records?" I climbed down the ladder. "Why? I just want to look at them." "For what reason?" He shrugged. "It is good to know where everything is." I wiped the sawdust from my hands and looked directly at him. "They are exactly where they have always been." He waited for me to continue, but I did not. The silence between us stretched longer than either of us expected. Finally, he smiled, although it looked forced. "You really do not trust anybody, do you?" I answered calmly. "Trust has nothing to do with privacy." He left a few minutes later without another word. That evening, Evelyn found me sitting alone on the porch. "He asked again?" she guessed. I nodded. "Maybe I am being stubborn." She sat beside me and slipped her hand into mine. "No, William. You are protecting the life we built together." I still remember the breeze moving through the maple tree as she rested her head against my shoulder. Neither of us realized we were sitting in one of the last peaceful evenings we would ever share there. A month later, I misplaced my house key. I searched every room before finally finding it on the kitchen counter. I laughed at myself and blamed old age. Looking back now, that explanation seems painfully convenient. A few days after that, Harold Simmons wandered over while I was trimming the hedges between our yards. Harold had lived next door for more than 30 years and noticed things most people overlooked. "William," he called, "did Daniel stop by yesterday?" "He did." "Why?" Harold hesitated before speaking. "I saw him standing at your front door after you drove into town. Thought maybe he was waiting for you." "He has his own key," I replied. Harold scratched his chin. "Maybe. It looked like he was doing something with the lock." I frowned. "Probably nothing." Harold nodded slowly. "Probably." We both returned to our work, but his words stayed with me all afternoon. That night I checked every door before going to bed, something I had never made a habit of doing. Evelyn noticed. "Everything all right?" she asked. Harold thought Daniel was checking the front lock yesterday. She grew unusually still. "Checking it?" "That is what he said." She lowered her eyes for a moment, then quietly asked, "William, if I asked you to trust me without asking questions, would you?" I smiled gently. "Of course." She reached across the table, covered my hand with hers. in whispered words I would not understand until much later. Good. Because there is something I need to do before it is too late, and the fewer people who know about it, the safer you will be. I was still turning Evelyn's last words over in my mind when someone knocked softly on the motel room door just after 9 the next morning. I already knew who it was before I opened it. Thomas Bennett had never been late a single day in the 32 years I had known him. He stood there wearing a navy overcoat, holding a weathered leather briefcase that looked as though it had traveled through half a lifetime with him. His gray hair had thinned over the years, but his calm blue eyes had not changed at all. "Good morning, William," he said gently. "May I come in?" I stepped aside without speaking. He set the briefcase on the small table beside the window, but did not open it. Instead, he looked around the modest room before letting out a quiet sigh. "Evelyn knew this might happen," he said. Those 6 words settled over the room more heavily than anything else I had heard since her funeral. I looked at him in disbelief. She knew? He nodded slowly. "Not every detail. But she believed someone would eventually try to force you out of your own home." I sank into the wooden chair. Why did she never tell me? Thomas smiled with sadness. "Because she knew exactly who you are. If she had warned you directly, you would have confronted Daniel immediately. She wanted to protect both of you for as long as she could." For several moments, neither of us spoke. Outside the motel window, an 18-wheeler rolled past on the highway, its distant rumble fading into the cold Tennessee morning. Finally, I asked the question that had been growing inside me ever since Daniel shut that front door. Did I fail as a father? Thomas looked directly at me before answering. "No. But sometimes good fathers spend so much time teaching generosity that they forget to teach gratitude." His words stung because they carried no anger, only truth. Thomas had known Daniel since he was born. He had attended birthdays, graduations, and our 25th wedding anniversary. He had watched our family grow older together. If anyone understood what had been lost, it was him. Before I could ask another question, my phone rang. The screen showed Pastor Michael Reynolds. "William," he said after I answered, "would you mind meeting me at the church this afternoon?" "Is something wrong?" "Not exactly. There are a few people here who would like to speak with you." Around noon, I drove back toward the church with Thomas following behind in his own car. The sanctuary looked much quieter without the flowers and mourners. Only a handful of people remained inside. Pastor Michael greeted me warmly. "I am glad you came." Standing nearby was Harold Simmons, hands tucked into the pockets of his old denim jacket. Beside him stood Margaret Ellis, the church secretary who had known Evelyn for nearly 20 years. They all greeted me with kindness that felt unfamiliar after everything that had happened. Pastor Michael cleared his throat. "William, after the funeral, several people stayed behind. We all witnessed what happened at your house." I lowered my eyes. "I wish you had not." "Neither do I," he replied. "But there is something you deserve to know." Harold stepped forward first. "I have kept quiet because I did not think it was my place. Now I think I was wrong." I listened without interrupting. "About 2 weeks before Evelyn passed away," Harold continued, "I saw her leaving Thomas's office. She looked worried, but she also looked determined." Thomas gave a small nod but said nothing. Margaret spoke next. "She stopped by the church the very next day. She asked me where we kept the fireproof document cabinet." I frowned. Why would she ask that? Margaret folded her hands together. "She told me she was leaving something important with someone she trusted. She never said what it was." Pastor Michael took a slow breath before adding his own memory. "The last conversation I had with Evelyn was after Sunday service. She asked me one question." I looked at him. "What did she ask?" He smiled sadly. "She asked whether people eventually reveal who they truly are when they believe nobody is watching." The room became completely silent. I felt as though every conversation I had ever shared with my wife was rearranging itself inside my memory. Pieces that once seemed ordinary now carried entirely different meanings. Thomas finally opened his briefcase, but instead of removing any papers, he reached inside and touched a sealed cream-colored envelope without taking it out. "Not yet," he said quietly. "There is still one legal step that has to happen first." "How much longer?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning." Before anyone could speak again, the church's front door opened. Daniel walked inside unexpectedly, followed by Rebecca. Neither of them had seen Thomas's briefcase. Neither of them noticed the expression on Harold's face or the concern in Pastor Michael's eyes. Daniel looked directly at me and forced a thin smile. "Dad," he said, I think we should finally have that conversation. Thomas calmly rested one hand on the locked briefcase and whispered just loudly enough for me to hear. He has no idea what Evelyn left behind. I looked at Daniel for a long moment before answering. The church felt strangely smaller now, as though every breath carried more weight than the last. He stood a few feet away with his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, trying to appear confident. Rebecca remained beside him, her expression carefully composed, but I noticed the way her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse. She was nervous. Daniel simply did not know it yet. What is there left to talk about? I asked quietly. He glanced around the sanctuary before lowering his voice. Can we do this somewhere private? Pastor Michael answered before I could. Anything that concerns William can be discussed here if he chooses. Daniel forced another smile. Pastor, I appreciate that, but this is family business. Thomas Bennett calmly stepped beside me. Sometimes family business becomes legal business. Daniel looked at him for the first time. I did not know you were involved. Thomas met his eyes without changing his expression. I have been involved with the Carter family for more than 3 decades. The room fell silent again. Daniel shifted his attention back to me. Dad, everything that happened. Maybe it happened too fast. I almost smiled. 2 days earlier, I no longer had a home. Now the timing was suddenly the problem. Too fast? I repeated. You replaced every lock while I was burying your mother. His eyes dropped for only a second. Rebecca and I thought. He stopped himself. Rebecca quietly finished the sentence. We thought it would be easier that way. Easier. It was an ordinary word, but hearing it attached to the worst day of my life hurt more than anger ever could. Before anyone spoke again, Harold slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and unfolded an old photograph. William, he said, handing it to me, I think you should have this back. The picture had faded around the edges. It showed 2 younger men standing in front of the unfinished frame of a house. One of them was me, covered in sawdust, smiling beside a pickup truck filled with lumber. The other was Harold, 30 years younger, holding a hammer above his head like a trophy. Daniel stared at the photograph with mild curiosity. I have never seen that before. Harold looked at him. That is because your father never liked talking about himself. I continued studying the picture while Harold spoke. People around town hired William to supervise major construction projects all across Williamson County. But when it came to building this house, he refused outside contractors. He worked every evening after finishing his regular job. Saturdays, Sundays, holidays. I watched him frame those walls one beam at a time. Pastor Michael smiled faintly. Evelyn once told me that William measured every window himself because he wanted the morning sunlight to reach the breakfast table exactly where she liked to drink her coffee. I swallowed hard. I had forgotten she ever said that. Daniel remained silent. I could see uncertainty beginning to replace confidence. Margaret Ellis stepped closer. Do you remember the church youth center renovation 15 years ago? She asked me. I nodded. Barely. Most people think the church received a grant. She smiled gently. We did not. Your father organized volunteers, donated materials, and quietly paid for everything the budget could not cover. Daniel frowned. Dad never mentioned that. Because he asked us not to, Pastor Michael replied. He believed kindness should never become advertising. I felt uncomfortable hearing people speak about things I had long forgotten. I had never considered them important enough to remember. To me, they were simply responsibilities. But watching Daniel's expression slowly change, I realized he had spent years believing I was just an old man living inside an aging house. He had never bothered learning the life that existed before he became old enough to remember it. Thomas finally opened one section of his briefcase and removed a worn manila folder secured with a red ribbon. He did not untie it. He simply rested it on the table beside him. Daniel's eyes immediately locked onto it. What is that? Thomas answered calmly. Something your mother asked me to protect. Rebecca took one cautious step forward. Is it a will? No. Property records? No. Daniel looked increasingly impatient. Then what is it? Thomas placed his hand over the folder again. Something that explains why your mother wanted everything to remain exactly as it was until after her funeral. Those words struck me as deeply as anyone else. Even I had not known that instruction existed. Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Rebecca, and for the first time since all of this began, I saw genuine worry pass between them. It lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough. Then Thomas reached back into his briefcase one final time and carefully lifted out the cream-colored envelope Evelyn had left behind. Across the front, written in her unmistakable handwriting, were only 7 simple words, to be opened only after William calls. Thomas held the envelope with both hands for a moment before breaking the seal. No one spoke. Even the old heating system inside the church seemed to fall silent. I watched his fingers unfold the cream-colored paper with the same care someone might use when opening a family photograph that could never be replaced. My heart was pounding, not because I expected my wife to rescue me from what had happened, but because I was about to hear her voice one more time through the words she had left behind. Thomas adjusted his glasses and looked at me first. "William, Evelyn wanted me to read this aloud exactly as she wrote it." I nodded, unable to trust my own voice. He began. "My dear William, if Thomas is reading this letter, then I am no longer beside you, and something has happened that I prayed never would. If you are standing alone, please remember that you have never truly been alone. Everything I have done during these last months has been to protect the man who spent his entire life protecting everyone else." I closed my eyes for just a second. That sounded exactly like Evelyn. She had always found a way to speak with kindness even when her heart was breaking. Thomas continued reading. "You have always believed that love asks for trust before proof. I have always admired that about you. But I have quietly learned that not everyone shares your heart." Across the room, I noticed Daniel shift uneasily. Rebecca stared at the wooden floor. Neither of them interrupted. "Several months ago," Thomas read, "I became concerned after hearing repeated conversations about selling our home before either of us had ever suggested leaving it. I did not tell William because I wanted him to spend whatever time we had left together in peace instead of suspicion." Pastor Michael slowly lowered his head. Harold folded his arms without taking his eyes off Daniel. Thomas paused briefly before continuing. "I asked Thomas Bennett to help me verify several legal records. What we discovered confirmed that someone had already begun preparing for decisions that William had never authorized." Daniel finally stepped forward. "That is not true," he said quickly. "I never did anything illegal." Thomas calmly looked up from the letter. "No one has accused you of a crime." Daniel hesitated. "Then why is everyone looking at me like this?" No one answered him. Thomas simply returned to the page. "If Daniel is present when this letter is read, I ask him to listen carefully before defending himself. A good man accepts the truth even when it is uncomfortable." Daniel opened his mouth but closed it again. For the first time since I had known him, my son looked less certain than frightened. Thomas continued, "William has never known every sacrifice I made to keep our family together because he was always too busy making sacrifices of his own. He worked late nights so Daniel could attend college without debt. He postponed retirement twice because our son wanted to start a business. He quietly refinanced our own savings after the recession without telling anyone because he refused to let Daniel lose his first home." I looked at Thomas in complete disbelief. "I never knew she wrote about that," I whispered. Thomas smiled gently. "She wanted the truth to survive both of you." Margaret covered her mouth with one hand. Harold slowly shook his head. Pastor Michael looked toward Daniel, waiting for some response. Daniel finally spoke, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Dad, why did you never tell me any of this?" I answered honestly, "Because parents are supposed to help their children. I never believed they should send invoices afterward." The room became painfully quiet. Rebecca looked at Daniel with an expression I could not quite read. It was no longer certainty. It was doubt. Thomas reached the final page of the letter. "There is one more truth that William himself does not know. I intentionally kept it from him because I wanted him to discover it only after he had seen people's true character. If you are hearing these words today, Thomas, please give William the second envelope exactly as we agreed." Every face in the room turned toward Thomas. He slowly folded Evelyn's letter, placed it back inside its envelope, and opened the worn manila folder that had remained tied with the faded red ribbon. From inside, he carefully removed a smaller sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Evelyn's unmistakable handwriting. Unlike the first letter, this one was thicker. I could feel that more than paper rested inside it. Thomas placed it gently into my hands and said in a quiet voice, "William, this one was meant for your eyes alone. But I believe that once you open it, everyone in this room will finally understand who you really are." I held the smaller envelope in my hands for what felt like an eternity. I recognized Evelyn's handwriting immediately. She had always written my name with a gentle curve beneath the final letter, a tiny habit she had never realized she had. For a moment, I simply traced those familiar lines with my thumb. It felt as though she were standing beside me again, quietly reminding me not to rush through something that mattered. Thomas waited patiently. No one else spoke. I finally opened the envelope and unfolded several neatly stacked pages. The first sheet was another handwritten note. Tucked behind it were photocopies of legal documents, building permits, canceled checks, and several photographs I had not seen in decades. My eyes moved back to Evelyn's words. William, if you are reading this, then people have already shown you what they believed your life was worth. Now it is time for them to discover the life you quietly built. I swallowed hard before continuing silently to myself. She reminded me of our earliest years, when every dollar mattered and every decision carried consequences. She wrote about evenings when I came home with blistered hands after working 2 construction jobs because we refused to borrow money we could not repay. She reminded me of the countless weekends spent helping neighbors repair roofs after storms without accepting payment. None of those memories surprised me. What surprised me was what came next. You never knew that I kept copies of everything. Every permit, every receipt, every contract. Not because I doubted you, but because I knew someday your kindness might leave you defenseless against someone who only valued paper. My eyes drifted toward the documents lying beneath the letter. The first permit carried my name as both builder and general contractor for our home in Franklin. The second showed every inspection signed and approved. Then came photographs of me framing the walls, pouring the foundation, and installing the roof with Harold standing beside me. Harold quietly smiled when he recognized himself in one of the pictures. I remember that day, he said softly. It was nearly 100 degrees outside. I smiled for the first time in days. You complained about the heat every 10 minutes. He chuckled, and you ignored me every single time. Even Daniel managed the faintest smile before it quickly disappeared. The atmosphere inside the church had changed. Nobody was arguing anymore. They were remembering. Thomas carefully arranged the documents across the long wooden table. These are not here to embarrass anyone, he said calmly. They simply establish the history Evelyn wanted preserved. Margaret stepped closer, studying one of the old photographs. William, this was before Daniel was born, was it not? About 2 years before, I answered. She looked around the room. Most of us never knew any of this. I shrugged gently. It was just life. Pastor Michael folded his hands. Sometimes the quietest lives leave the deepest footprints. Daniel remained standing a few feet away, staring at the papers without touching them. Finally, he spoke. Dad, I honestly thought Grandpa helped pay for the house. I looked at him with genuine surprise. Who told you that? He hesitated. Nobody exactly. I just assumed. Harold shook his head. Your father borrowed almost nothing. He earned every board in that place. Daniel slowly sat down on one of the church pews. His shoulders seemed lower than I had ever seen them. Rebecca remained beside him, but something had shifted between them. She no longer answered for him or finished his sentences. Instead, she quietly asked, Daniel, did you ever ask your father how he built it? He looked down at his hands. No. Did you ever ask what it meant to him? He remained silent. She let out a slow breath. Neither did I. Thomas opened the final section of the folder. Inside rested a thin blue notebook, no larger than a paperback novel. Its edges were worn from years of careful handling. This, he said, is something Evelyn asked me to protect even more carefully than the letters. I frowned. I have never seen that before. No, Thomas replied, because she wanted you to see it only after people revealed what mattered most to them. Daniel looked up. What is it? Thomas rested one hand gently on the notebook. It is a record your wife kept for nearly 15 years. Rebecca frowned. A journal? Partly. Thomas nodded, but it is also something else. He slowly opened the cover, revealing page after page of handwritten entries, attached receipts, dated notes, and folded documents secured inside protective sleeves. My heart began to race again. Evelyn had always written in the evenings after dinner, but I had believed those notebooks held recipes, gardening notes, and birthday reminders. I had never imagined she had been documenting something far more important. Thomas carefully turned to a page marked with a faded ribbon. He looked first at me, then at Daniel. Everything changes after this page, he said quietly, because this is the day Evelyn realized someone had already begun planning to take the house while both of you were still living inside it. Thomas turned the page with the faded ribbon, and the entire room leaned into the silence before a single word was spoken. Evelyn's handwriting filled the page, neat and steady as always. At the top, she had written a date from almost 9 months before her passing. Beneath it was a simple sentence. Today, I realized that fear had entered my son's heart before greed ever reached his hands. Thomas looked at Daniel before continuing. Evelyn did not write to condemn you. She wrote because she wanted to understand you. Daniel lowered his head. Thomas read on. Daniel believes losing money would destroy his family. He does not yet understand that losing his character would cost him far more. Rebecca covered her mouth with one trembling hand. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she did not wipe them away. Thomas carefully turned another page. Tucked inside was a business card from a real estate investor, held in place with a paper clip. Attached to it was one of Evelyn's notes. Found this inside Daniel's jacket after he accidentally left it on the kitchen chair. He later told William he had simply met a client for coffee. I chose not to argue because I wanted to know whether honesty would eventually return on its own. Daniel stared at the card as though he had never seen it before. I remember that meeting, he whispered. I never agreed to sell the house. Thomas nodded calmly. The journal never says you did. Daniel looked up, confused. Then why keep this? Thomas answered gently. Because your mother believed intentions matter long before actions become permanent. The distinction settled heavily over everyone present. Evelyn had not spent her final months building a case against her son. She had been recording the slow distance growing inside her own family, hoping someone would recognize it before it was too late. Thomas continued reading selected passages. They described conversations, concerns, moments of silence, and small changes that seemed insignificant at the time. None of them accused, none of them exaggerated. Together they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Daniel had allowed financial pressure to become the voice guiding his decisions. Rebecca had encouraged practical solutions without realizing how deeply they wounded the people she claimed to love. I listened quietly, feeling neither triumph nor satisfaction, only sadness. When the reading ended, Pastor Michael folded his hands. I have spent many years walking with families through grief, he said softly. Very few are broken by a single terrible decision. Most are weakened by hundreds of smaller choices that slowly replace gratitude with entitlement. Harold nodded in agreement. You do not wake up one morning without respect for your father. You stop showing it one conversation at a time. Daniel remained seated for several moments before finally standing. His eyes met mine for the first time since the funeral, and this time there was no confidence left to hide behind. Dad, he said quietly, I kept telling myself I was trying to protect our future. Somewhere along the way, I stopped protecting the man who gave me one. His voice cracked before he finished the sentence. Rebecca stepped closer to him. I pushed harder than I should have, she admitted. I kept asking about the house because I believed security came from property. I never stopped to ask whether we were destroying the very family we wanted to protect. No one rushed to comfort either of them. Their words needed room to settle. They had reached this moment through their own choices, and now they had to stand inside the truth those choices had created. Thomas quietly gathered the journal and returned it to the folder. Evelyn instructed me to preserve these records, not to punish anyone, but to make certain the truth could never be rewritten after she was gone. He then reached into his briefcase one final time and removed a small envelope bearing the seal of the county recorder's office. He handed it to me. This completes my responsibilities. I opened it slowly. Inside was an officially certified document confirming what Evelyn had arranged months before her death. She had established legal protections that ensured no transfer, sale, or change affecting our home could occur without my direct written consent while I was alive. Everything Daniel had hoped to control had never been within his authority to control in the first place. Thomas looked toward Daniel with kindness rather than judgment. The law has already spoken. The house remains exactly where your wife intended it to remain. Daniel closed his eyes and slowly nodded. There was nothing left to argue. The consequences he faced were not created by revenge. They were the natural result of decisions built on assumptions instead of conversations, on fear instead of trust. A few relatives who had quietly gathered outside the sanctuary during the afternoon began filtering away one by one, speaking in hushed voices. Their expressions toward me had changed completely. They no longer saw an old man who had been left behind. They saw the husband who had quietly built a family, the the father who had given more than anyone realized, and the man whose dignity had remained intact when everything else had been taken from him. As the church slowly emptied, Daniel walked toward the doorway, then stopped and turned back. "Dad," he asked softly, if you are willing, may I come see you tomorrow?" I looked at the folded letters still resting in my hands before answering. "Tomorrow is a new day, Daniel." He nodded without expecting anything more. As the evening sunlight stretched across the empty pews, I realized that justice had finally arrived, not with raised voices or broken relationships, but with truth patiently revealing itself. And for the first time since I had whispered goodbye beside Evelyn's grave, I felt that somewhere beyond the sorrow, the long road home had finally begun. The next morning, I drove back to the house before the sun had fully climbed above the hills of Franklin. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A newspaper rested at the end of a driveway. The maple tree Evelyn and I planted more than 40 years earlier swayed gently in the cool breeze. For the first time in several days, I did not feel like a stranger approaching my own front porch. Daniel's truck was already parked in the driveway. He was sitting alone on the front steps, still wearing yesterday's clothes, holding the ring of new keys that had caused so much pain. When he saw me, he stood immediately. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he walked toward me and held out the keys with both hands. "These never should have replaced yours," he said quietly. I looked at the keys but did not take them right away. "Why are you here so early?" He lowered his eyes. "Because I spent all night realizing I have been trying to inherit a house instead of honoring the people who made it a home." His words carried no excuses this time, only regret. I accepted the keys, then reached into my coat pocket and took out my own old brass key. It was scratched from decades of use, its edges worn smooth by countless mornings and evenings. I held both keys in my hand before removing the newer one from the ring. "This one belongs to the past now," I said softly. Daniel nodded. Without another word, he took the replacement key, walked to the trash bin beside the garage, and dropped it inside. The sound was almost too quiet to hear, but somehow it felt louder than every argument we had never had. Rebecca stepped onto the porch carrying a cardboard box. "I packed everything exactly where we found it," she said. "Your photographs, Evelyn's recipes, the blanket she kept on the living room chair, even the small wooden birdhouse she loved." Tears filled her eyes again. "I cannot undo what we did, William, but I hope someday you will remember that I finally learned the difference between helping a family and trying to control one." I gave her a gentle nod. "That lesson will serve you for the rest of your life." Together, we walked into the house. Nothing had changed, yet everything had. The morning light still reached the breakfast table exactly where Evelyn had always liked to drink her coffee. The old clock still ticked above the fireplace. Her reading glasses still rested beside the chair where she used to spend quiet evenings with a book in her lap. I placed her handwritten letter beside the framed photograph from our 40th anniversary and stood there in silence. "I made it home," I whispered, "just like you believed I would." "Behind me," Daniel quietly said. "Mom knew me better than I knew myself." I turned toward him. She also believed people could choose differently. He looked around the room. "Do you think I still can?" I thought about everything that had happened. The funeral, the locked door, the long nights, the letters, the journal, the truth that had patiently uncovered itself without anger or revenge. "That choice has always been yours," I answered. "The only difference is that now you understand what it costs." Over the following weeks, life settled into a quieter rhythm. Daniel and Rebecca found a small house across town instead of trying to remain in mine. They visited only after calling first, something that had never mattered before but somehow mattered now. Respect often begins with small habits. Pastor Michael continued stopping by for coffee every few Saturdays. Harold still wandered over whenever one of us pretended we knew more about fixing an old fence than we actually did. Margaret brought one of Evelyn's favorite lemon cakes on what would have been her 70th birthday, and we spent the afternoon sharing stories instead of tears. No one ever mentioned the locked door again. We did not need to. The lesson had already found its place in every heart that witnessed it. A few months later, as spring arrived, I carried a young dogwood tree into the backyard. Evelyn had always wanted another one near the porch, but said we would plant it when we finally had more time. I smiled as I lowered it into the earth. "We finally found the time," I said quietly. After covering the roots with fresh soil, I walked over to the old wooden rocking chair we had shared for decades. I brushed away a thin layer of pollen, sat down, and watched the afternoon sunlight dance through the maple leaves. On the small table beside me rested two things: my old brass house key and Evelyn's final letter. One reminded me where I lived. The other reminded me who I wanted to remain. I have learned that dignity is not something another person can lock outside a door. It stays with you every time you choose honesty over bitterness, patience over revenge, and peace over pride. If you have ever been made to feel unwanted by the very people you loved most, I hope you remember this. Protect your kindness, but also protect your boundaries. Love your family deeply, but never believe that love requires surrendering your self-respect. Your worth does not disappear because someone else fails to recognize it. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is stand quietly in the truth until the truth learns to speak for itself. If this story touched your heart, I hope you will consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who may need this reminder today. The simplest lesson I can leave behind is this: a house can be inherited, but a home must be earned through love, respect, and gratitude. Thank you for spending this journey with me. Until we meet again in another story, may your home always be filled with peace, your heart remain steady through every storm, and may you never forget the quiet strength that already lives within you.